You know what's strange? We have washing machines, dishwashers, we can order groceries from our phones, and somehow dinner still feels exhausting every single day. Honestly, why does 4:30 p.m. feel like an ambush? You open the fridge and there's technically food in there. Vegetables, a few leftovers, sauces, random things you bought with good intentions 3 days ago. Enough things that logically a meal should absolutely be possible. But your brain still goes, I have no idea what to make. And I think it's kind of like opening a full closet, feeling like you have nothing to wear. The problem isn't that there are no options. The problem is that there are too many options and your brain is already tired. And I think that feeling has very little to do with cooking itself. Because usually the exhausting part isn't chopping vegetables, it's having to decide again every single day. Especially when life is already full. Work, kids, appointments, email, shopping, trying to remember you replied to that message 3 days ago. By the time dinner enters the picture, many of us feel already mentally full. And food is relentless. It comes back every single day, 3 times a day actually, which honestly feels a little aggressive when you think about it. And I think food itself has also become emotionally heavier than it used to be, because food isn't just food anymore. Now it feels connected to health and productivity and discipline and self-improvement and morality and parenting and environmental responsibility. Every meal suddenly feels loaded with meaning. And then there's the nutrition confusion. At this point, it feels like every week there's a new thing we're supposed to worry about. One person says carbs are the problem. Another says seed oils. Then suddenly protein becomes the most important thing in the universe again. At some point, you're standing in the supermarket holding oats, like, are you good or bad now? And honestly, I think a lot of people carry around low-level nutrition anxiety all the time without even realizing it. Because even when you're trying your best, it feels like the rules keep changing. Sometimes I think the problem isn't lack of information anymore. It's surviving the amount of information. We have more experts, documentaries, podcasts, and opinions than ever before, and somehow many people feel less confident about feeding themselves. And social media definitely doesn't help. Normal everyday dinners now compete with beautifully filmed meals made in perfect lighting by people who somehow own 12 tiny ceramic bowls and apparently wash fresh herbs recreationally. Sometimes it feels like we're expected to eat like a wellness influencer and a restaurant at the same time. And meanwhile, most people are just trying to survive a Tuesday evening. And then there's the fact that we live in complete food abundance now. You walk into a supermarket and it's bursting with options. Different breads, different yogurts, different snacks, different health labels, different better versions of the same thing. And weirdly, I don't think having more options made people feel calmer around food. I think for many people it did the opposite. Because when there are too many options, it can start feeling like there are no options. Not because food isn't available, but because every choice suddenly comes with information attached to it. Opinions, trade-offs, decisions. And for many people, there are also real health considerations involved now. Allergies, intolerances, blood sugar issues, sensory issues, different dietary needs in the same household. So dinner stops being just cooking. It becomes this ongoing mental balancing act. And I think many people quietly feel like they're failing at feeding themselves correctly. Not because they don't care, but because modern food culture expects ordinary people to constantly make expert-level decisions while already overwhelmed. And I think this is why so much food advice doesn't really work long-term, because most advice adds more complexity, more rules, more optimization, more things to track. But honestly, I don't think exhausted people need more complicated systems. I think they need relief. I think they need meals that are flexible enough to survive real life. I think they need fewer decisions. And maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I think eating well should feel much easier than it currently does. It should feel almost stupidly simple, like simple enough that your brain can keep doing it even on low energy days. Because that's what actually sticks. Not perfection, not motivation. It has to become so easy that it almost feels like cheating. And once I started thinking about food that way, everything changed for me. Because instead of trying to optimize every single meal, I became much more interested in reducing friction, reducing decisions, reducing mental load, creating some kind of autopilot. And for years I thought recipes were the answer. I collected so many recipes. Every new recipe felt exciting for a moment because I felt like this one will finally make dinner easier. But then 5 p.m. arrived again and I still didn't know what to cook. Because recipes don't necessarily remove mental load. Sometimes they add more of it. Now, every meal becomes this tiny project where you need the right ingredients, enough time, enough energy, and ideally the emotional stability to cook something with 17 steps after a long day. And I slowly realized that people who seem calm and relaxed about cooking usually aren't reinventing dinner every night. They're not relying on inspiration all the time. They're working from structures, patterns, things that reduce the number of decisions they have to make. And that completely changed how I started thinking about food. Instead of asking, what recipe should I make? I started asking, what kind of meal would make sense today? And weirdly, that feels much lighter. And I think this problem becomes especially obvious whenever people try to change the way they eat. That could be eating more plant-based. It could be managing diabetes, food intolerances, cholesterol concerns, whatever it is. The moment your old food autopilot stops working, everything suddenly feels much harder. Because now you're not just making dinner anymore. You're rebuilding dinner. And I think most people try to solve that by replacing meals one recipe at a time. So it suddenly becomes a new breakfast recipe, a new lunch recipe, a new dinner recipe, or 2 or 3. And very quickly, the whole thing starts feeling mentally exhausting. Not necessarily because the food itself is difficult, but because your old structures disappeared and nothing replaced them yet. And I know this very well personally because I started cooking plant-based overnight more than 12 years ago. Back then I also approached it mostly through recipes at first. And recipes can absolutely help in the beginning. But over time I realized that recipes alone don't really create ease. What actually creates ease is having simple structures you can fall back on without thinking so hard every single day. Meanwhile, people are already overwhelmed trying to feed themselves in general. And I think this is why so many people struggle to stick with it. Not because they failed, but because they never built a system that was flexible enough for real life. Low energy days, busy weeks, forgotten groceries, someone gets sick, kids refusing things for mysterious reasons, coming home exhausted and needing dinner to happen anyway. That's real life. And I think any way of eating that only works when life is going perfectly is eventually going to fall apart. That's why I became much more interested in creating systems that reduce friction instead of adding more pressure. I'm a scientist by background, so my brain naturally looks for patterns and systems. And at some point, I became really interested in this question. Why does feeding ourselves feel so mentally exhausting now, even though we technically have more convenience than ever before? Because I could see how many people struggled with this. Families, busy professionals, parents, people living alone, people trying to eat healthier, people trying to eat more plant-based. Everybody seemed overwhelmed by food in some way. And over time, I started developing my own structures and systems to reduce that mental load in our lives. Not perfect systems, flexible systems. Things that make plant-based eating feel calmer, easier, and much more sustainable in real life. Because honestly, I think most people don't need more food rules. They need more calm, more flexibility, more meals that still work when life gets messy. And that's something I care about very deeply. I've actually been building a full framework around this idea because I think food should support your life, not take over your brain. If this topic resonates with you, you can find more information below. So if food feels mentally exhausting sometimes, you're absolutely not alone. And you're probably not a bad cook either. There's a good chance you're just carrying too many decisions without enough structure underneath them. And once you reduce that mental load, everything starts feeling lighter. Shopping gets easier, cooking gets easier, eating more plant-based gets easier. Not because you suddenly became more disciplined, but because your brain finally has something to lean on. And honestly, I think that's what a lot of us are actually hungry for now. Not more information, just less chaos. Thank you for watching, and I see you in the next one.